Evangelicals enter politics. Remember, when we talk about evangelical Christians, we're talking about people who believe at least one of the following, and maybe all three. One, that the Bible is the Word of God and is the authority on the Christian religion. It is not to be interpreted. It is not to be seen as a historical document. It is the Word of God, not a document created by men that is problematic and flawed, but the Word of God and infallible. Second, evangelical Christians could believe that Christians have a duty to spread their faith, not because it's good for their church, but because it's what good Christians do. They spread Christianity to others. They try to recruit others to Christianity for the benefit of others' salvation. Third, evangelical Christians could believe that individuals can have a personal relationship, a personal experience with God, that through prayer they can communicate with God and God can answer. Evangelical Christians believe at least one of these three things, sometimes all three. Evangelical Christians are sometimes referred to today as born-again Christians. We talked about evangelical Christians first and their influence on the First and Second Great Awakening and their involvement in those religious movements. In the 1970s, they're going to start to become more involved in politics. By the late 1970s, in fact, they are a force in politics. And it has a lot to do with what evangelical Christians saw in American life, American society, and considered to be signs of moral and religious decline, a decline in American values. If you look at divorce rates over this time period, following the free love movement of the 1960s and the idea that you shouldn't stay in a loveless marriage, divorce rates are going to increase. Some evangelicals saw that as a problem. If you look at the increased use of drugs and not just the raw numbers, but the panic that is created over drug use, that's seen as a sign of moral decay. If you look at the fight for gay rights and gay equality for gay Americans, that's seen as a problem to some, not all, but to some evangelicals. The feminist movement is also seen as a threat to moral and traditional religious values by some evangelicals, because feminism is advocating for women to break out of those separate spheres, to reject the cult of domesticity. And remember, a key part of the cult of domesticity, of the domestic sphere of women, was taking care of the moral and religious values of the family, especially the children. If women are fighting for equality, if women are fighting for equal job opportunities, who's going to stay home and raise good and virtuous American Christian citizens? So the feminist movement is seen as a threat. Roe versus Wade is up there. The Supreme Court declaring that abortion is legal is seen as a sign of decline, a sign of a loss of American morality or a loss of American values by some evangelicals. And Engel versus Vital is up there as well. This is the Supreme Court decision that ruled that prayer in public schools is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the First Amendment. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause of freedom of religion. Many people supported this ruling, but for some evangelicals, this looks like we're taking God out of schools, and to some evangelicals, that's too much. Now, there have always been evangelicals in the United States since before 1750, before that First Great Awakening. And there were liberal evangelicals on the left. There were conservative evangelicals on the right. There were moderate evangelicals in the middle. There were evangelicals who never participated in politics. In fact, evangelicals did not participate in politics any more than your average American before the 1970s. It's in the 1970s and leading into the 1980s that two things are going to happen. One, evangelicals are going to become more involved in politics. They're going to vote more often. They're going to donate more to candidates. They're going to organize and volunteer more for campaign efforts. And two, they're going to coalesce or collect behind conservative Republican candidates at this time. In 1979, a religious leader named Jerry Falwell creates what's known as the moral majority with the goal of getting evangelicals politically active. They had voted before, but they had voted as union members, or they had voted as Southerners, or they had voted as Westerners. They had voted, their voting decisions had been guided by other parts of their life. Falwell and others want to get evangelicals thinking about the issues that are important to them as evangelical Christians. Get them more politically active along those lines. And they are going to support candidates that are pro-life, meaning opposed to abortion, that are pro-family, all right? So that could be interpreted a couple ways. Anti-feminism, also anti-gay. Pro-moral, so opposed to drugs, maybe opposed to gay rights, maybe opposed to some of the other things we talked about. And pro-American, so anti-communist. They're not going to be talking about radical redistribution of wealth, no matter how capitalism might conflict with some Christian teachings. The moral majority is going to argue for opposing communism on the global stage. This group is followed by the much larger Christian coalition organized and led by Reverend Pat Robertson. And this group is going to carry on those same goals and continue to get evangelicals even more involved in politics. Together, evangelicals are going to join with others to create what's known as the New Right, that are going to advocate for conservative causes, okay? So less government spending, lower taxes, maybe a rollback on some abortion rights, opposition to some gay rights, more power at the state and local level, less power for the federal government. A lot of the ideas of the new rights, the bills and laws and policies, come out of a new think tank that emerges at the time in Washington, D.C., known as the Heritage Foundation. Imagine a bunch of really smart people with conservative beliefs who write bills and write policies, and they're the ideological, intellectual guide for the new right. They are going to, the new right, evangelicals with them are going to lobby Congress for their positions, for their policies that they want to see enacted, and they're going to raise money for campaigns too. These organizations are very powerful because they collect donations from their members and can send those directly to candidates. And a candidate who gets a lot of those donations was Ronald Reagan. Now, in the election of 1980, at home, domestically, things are not looking good. We have a high level of inflation and high unemployment. Those are two economic problems that normally don't happen at the same time. These have almost everything to do with high energy prices at the time, the high price of gasoline as a result of the high price of oil. So the economy is really, really struggling, perhaps more so than it had since the Great Depression. Abroad, on the global stage, the United States is not looking good either. In Iran, the hostage crisis continues to make America look weak. We are being, Iran, a smaller developing country, not the Soviet Union, but a smaller developing country, is getting the best of us on the global stage. At the same time, the Soviet Union had just invaded Afghanistan. Now, if you think about containment, stopping the spread of communism, Invading Afghanistan is a clear spread of Soviet communism, but the United States was unable to really effectively, directly resist that. It looks like the United States is just kind of giving up on keeping the Soviets out of Afghanistan, although we were supporting opposition forces through clandestine means. I say all this because if the economy is bad, the guy in office, the president running for re-election, is probably not going to get re-elected. A bad economy is bad for Jimmy Carter in 1980. Adding to his problems for re-election were the problems he was facing on the global stage. And he was going up against a very popular challenger, Ronald Reagan, a former actor who got the nickname the Great Communicator. He used his acting skills, he used his experience as a former TV show host to be considered a really great public speaker. He was able to articulate in ways that many Americans explained what he wanted to do. And his best line of the whole campaign came in one of the debates when he asked the American people, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? In other words, has Jimmy Carter done enough to improve your lives? And economically, many people were not. As a result, Reagan wins a pretty much overwhelming victory. He gets more than 50% of the popular vote. Carter didn't top 42%. And if you look at the electoral map, it looks even more one-sided, with Carter winning his home state as well as only 4 or 5 other states. This Republican victory can also be attributed to better organization on the part of the Republican Party. They use databases to be systematic in their efforts to get out the vote, get more conservatives out to the polls, and actually get them to pull the lever and cast a vote on Election Day. And Reagan is successful with winning some of those people in the middle. He takes home almost all of the evangelical Christian vote because they are now coalesced behind Republicans. But if we look at the whole country, some of those people in the middle, some of those moderates, even some moderate union members, for example, support Reagan. They're what we call Reagan Democrats. And that's just how popular Reagan was. He's able to get even some people who traditionally voted Democrat to cast a vote for the Republican candidate in the presidential election of 1980. That's what gets Ronald Reagan into office.